Hi there, this is Tammy Everts. I am super happy to be uh, here at All Day Hay, and for the next 45 minutes-ish, I will be talking about my very opinionated guide to performance budgets. If you don't know what a web performance budget is, that's okay. I will be talking about that. If you don't know what web performance means, that's okay. I'll be talking about that too. So I'm looking forward to just sort of jumping in. And what I love about this format is that I'm also, by the magic of editing and technology, as you're watching this, I'm going to be in the Slack channel for the event. So I will be answering questions there. So get over there and say hi. Ask me anything almost. This is where I live, just the state of the world today. I'm super interested in knowing where other people are from. So this is where I live, just west of the Rockies in British Columbia, Canada. This tiny little ski town. I don't want to say the middle of nowhere because it definitely feels like someplace to me, but it's a great little place. If you're ever by this way, come and say hey. So this is me. Probably the chance that you're going to get to my ski town are very, very slim. So you can also find me on Twitter at Tam Everts. And I work for a really excellent company called Speed Curve. I've been here for exactly 4 years. And I've been doing performance things for about the last 11 or 12 years. I kind of lose track. But at Speed Curve, we help companies of all sizes to measure the performance of their web pages. So by performance, I mean how fast is the page, how responsive is the page, how fast does it feel, and how responsive does it feel when people are actually using it. And if it doesn't feel fast or responsive, why? How do you fix those problems? And then also, how do you kind of correlate the awesome optimization work that you did with actually making users faster or improving your business? So I get to do a lot of talks like this, and I talk to a lot of customers, and I get to kind of explain how to measure all these fun things. And I'm going to share some of that with you folks. I mentioned I've been doing performance things for a long time. O'Reilly invited me to write this book, Time is Money, where I corralled a lot of case studies around just sort of proving what is the business value in investing in making your pages more performant. And this is out there. If you're interested in still buying print books, I don't know if anybody does that anymore. You can also find a lot of great case studies at WPO Stats. So it's just WPOstats.com, and it's a website that's a repository of case studies that I curate among a few other folks, Tim Kadlik and Sergey Chernyshov, if you know either of those folks. And it's just a great collection that's sort of sorted by metric. So whatever metric you care about, if it's SEO or bounce rate or conversion, there's probably a handful of case studies, at least in WPO Stats, that kind of proves the value of the positive impact of investing in performance on that metric. Oh, and just to go back, just a little shameless plug here. It's actually totally vendor agnostic, but I'm going to plug it anyways. If you have a case study, also hook us up with that, because we're always adding more case studies here. And then there's also this great little tool that I'm really happy to be part of, which is the industry benchmarks project, where for the past year and a half-ish, we've been tracking and kind of making openly available performance data for top sites in a lot of different industries: auto, retail, tech, media, and in the EU and in the United States. And if you're interested and you want to see, oh, okay, well, how do these different sites stack up against different metrics, you can come to speedcurve.com benchmarks and check it out. So let's kind of get back to kind of what we're here for, talking about performance budgets. And the first question, of course, is what exactly is a performance budget? Simplest way to think about it is that it's a threshold that you create for the metrics that are most meaningful for your site. And so kind of those metrics can be around milestone timing. So if you're familiar with metrics like start render. That's kind of measuring a milestone in when your page begins to render. They can be kind of quantity-based metrics like what's the size of the page or the weight of the images on the page or how many JavaScript files are on the page. Or they can be rules-based, like more recently it's Lighthouse scores, but there are other scores out there like cumulative layout shift, page speed insight scores, kind of a little bit more dated, but still relevant for some folks. So you can create thresholds and budgets for all of these metrics and get alerted on when you go out of bounds on those metrics. So what a good performance budget should show you is what is your budget? When do you go out of bounds? How long do you stay out of bounds? And ideally, when do you come back within your threshold? And so that can look a lot like this. You can see this is a time series chart where we're tracking start render time. And I'll get into kind of definitions for a lot of these metrics very shortly. But start render time simply just being when visual content begins to render in the viewport. And we're doing that for the Amazon homepage across Chrome, Firefox, and Internet Explorer. And you can see that over time, the threshold, the budget, which is represented by this straight red line, is 2 seconds. So we want the page to have started to render within 2 seconds, ideally faster. And you can see the little blips where we go out of bounds here are when that's basically, these are the alerts, these are the notifications. So this chart's kind of doing exactly what a good performance budget should do. It should show you what the budget is, that you're mostly within it, when you go out of bounds, and when you kind of return back to your safety zone. And why do you need them? For some folks, it might be a bit self-explanatory, but I'll just kind of dip into this case study that made a big impression on me when I was first starting out in performance. So there used to be a conference that O'Reilly put on called the Velocity Conference, which was completely focused on web performance. And this company called Shopzilla presented a case study in 2009 where they shared that they did this performance optimization sprint in their dev team. They took their average load time from 6 seconds down to 1.2 seconds, that's a lot of hard work. And they increased their conversion rate by up to 12%, and they increased page views by 25%, which is amazing. So it's a great case study, really positive. And that kind of stuck with me. And then kind of fast forward to 2011, they presented another case study, also at Velocity, where they shared that in the time in between this 2009 case study and the 2011 one, they kind of took their eye off the ball, and average load time degraded to 5 seconds. They started getting, kind of annoyed, frustrated emails from users saying things like, I will not come back to this site again. And so finally, there was kind of internal pressure to refocus on performance. And at the time that they presented kind of this new data at the 2011 Velocity, even in this short period of time after they had done this refocusing, they already saw their conversion rate starting to increase again. So, how did this happen? How did they kind of get to that state? Kind of a lot of very relatable challenges and problems that I'm sure, we can all kind of understand. One, not having any consistent long-term front-end measurement in place. Being constantly tasked with developing new features. So you can't really babysit the features that you already have and the site that you already had if you're just constantly being tasked to build other things. And then, badly implemented third parties, kind of back in the day when, third parties were just starting to kind of burst on the scene, and it was a little bit of a Wild West situation. Waiting too long to tackle problems, kind of relying on performance sprints to kind of like, oh, okay, well, we'll fix that in 6 months when we do a sprint. And really just having no way to track regressions. Those are the big issues there. So kind of what that looks like in a chart, and this isn't a chart from the Shopzilla case study, but just to kind of show what that can look like if you take your eye off things. You start off kind of mostly underneath the budget, but maybe blipping up every so often. But then if you're not really focusing on, okay, what was causing those little blips, things worsen. code changes on the page, new content gets added, new third parties get added, and next thing you know, you're kind of just consistently outside your threshold. And if nobody's paying attention to this, then how are you supposed to be able to address it? So the big questions that I get asked, as I mentioned earlier, I talk to a lot of companies, developers, product managers, marketing folks, and when we talk about performance budgets, these are the three questions I get asked the most. Well, which metrics should I even focus on? It's a really good question. There are so many metrics. What should my budget thresholds even be? And then how do I stay on top of them, and how do I share them with other people on my team so that we can actually act on them really quickly whenever we go out of bounds? So that's going to be the gist of what I want to talk about for the next little bit. So let's start with which metrics to focus on. I would love to tell you there was just one unicorn metric. There isn't. But I get asked that a lot. Like, what if there's just one thing I can show to the executive team? But unfortunately, no, not the case. What we really have is something kind of more like this. It's just, and this is kind of just actually a super simplified chart. If you do performance, or you've been doing performance for a while and you're using performance tools, you know that you're seeing dozens and dozens, possibly even hundreds of different metrics that you can chase, depending on how nuanced your tool is and what, kind of how deep you want to go. And so it really is kind of an OMG, WTF kind of situation. Like, where do you even start? And I find it really helpful to keep these three questions in mind to apply as a litmus test to any metrics that you're considering tracking. Does this metric let you know that the page is actually loading? Because, you want to know that the page is even working, that nothing's kind of broken behind the scenes. And from a user's perspective, is it loading? Are they getting early visual feedback that they're even on a page that's going to work for them? Can I use the page? Like, can I even interact with it? And then how does it feel? Does it feel really janky? Does it feel sluggish? If you're on mobile, are you going to have that frustrating experience of, like, you think that everything is rendered and then you go to tap something and something else is slid in like the 500 milliseconds that it took for your finger to get to the screen, and you open up the wrong link, and it's, to all of those things are what you want to be kind of thinking about when you get started, at least with thinking about what metrics to track. And obviously, if you've been doing this for a while and you've been, using performance budgets for a while, there are all kinds of use cases that are a lot more nuanced for needing to track much more kind of arcane metrics. But this is just to kind of get you started and kind of baby stepping with this. And what tools do we use for tracking performance metrics and creating budgets? If you are new to performance, I'll just kind of break this down for you really quickly. We have synthetic tools and we have real user monitoring tools. And ideally, you're using both because they do very different things and they're very complementary. So it's not an either or situation. So for your synthetic this is kind of letting you test individual pages in almost like a lab-like setting. So sometimes we see this referred to as lab testing. And what a synthetic testing tool lets you do is plug in specific URLs and then test kind of to simulate what that URL, how it would render given very specific network, browser, geographic, other conditions that you create. So you're kind of creating this simulator that runs tests on specific URLs. And ideally, you're doing this over time so you can see the impact of code changes over time on this same page under all of these kind of environmental conditions. And synthetic testing is great because it lets you compare any sites, like your site, compared to your competitor sites. It gives you very detailed kind of analysis and best practices that you need to apply to your pages and kind of what rules you might be breaking. It gives you things like waterfall charts, film strips from videos, all kinds of great stuff like that. Real user monitoring, on the other hand, which is also called field testing, depending on which kind of vendor you're using, is more specific, but also, as the name kind of implies, it is based on real world user experiences, and you install a JavaScript snippet on your page that then collects very specific, totally not anything that's going to impose on identity stuff, but it's going to collect information about the user's browser environment. So what browser are they using? Where are they located in terms of like kind of city, country, and then how the page actually performed for that unique user. And like I said, it's not collecting like IP addresses or personal information, names, or anything that's personally identifiable. But what the value of that data is, if you collect enough of it, you can start to get really interesting perspectives into how is your site actually performing in the real world for different cohorts of users in different regions, different browsers, that sort of thing. And because real user monitoring, or RUM, is also tracking things like bounce rate, you can correlate all of your performance metrics with metrics like bounce rate. So you can actually see what is the impact of performance, of site slowness or speed on how likely people are to bounce. So this is kind of like, if you want to think about it this way, this is your synthetic testing, clean, sterile. It's not going to have any gotchas like, oh, your site went down, or anything like that. And it's very specific to whatever test environment you've created. And it generates results like this, test results like this, where you can see a film strip view of the page rendering. You can see a handful of kind of key metrics and kind of how they line up to how the page rendered, and when those different metrics fire, that sort of thing. And you can even see kind of competitive benchmarking, where you can see how, in this case, I tested my blog against some of my friends in the performance community, Steve Souders and Tim Cadlick, and my colleague Joseph Wynn. He's wildly inaccurate. He's not actually. He's very accurate. Anyways, and you can kind of see how you compare over time and get these like great little stacked film strip views that show you that as well. RUM, as I've said, is a little bit more of a crazy kind of anything could happen situation, because you're actually talking about real users in the real world. But it lets you understand things like, well, okay, of your actual users, how many of those users are experiencing what we call like unhappy page views? They're just subpar. We know that pages below certain thresholds, certain speeds, people are more likely to be dissatisfied with those experiences. You can actually see over time how large a chunk of your traffic, of your page views, is unhappy. And you can also measure interactions, such as when did the first scroll or click or key interaction happen on a page or on a set of pages, and then first input delay, which is how long did it take for the page to actually respond to whatever that interaction was. So these are things you can only get from RUM. And these metrics are really great ways of seeing, is the page broken? Is there if you've got really high first input delay or FID numbers, it's a sign that maybe people aren't finding, the content that you need, or that they're when they're clicking on whatever it is they need to click on, it's just not responding. And as I mentioned earlier, because we're correlating bounce rate, or we're capturing bounce rate information, we can correlate things like bounce rate against your performance metrics like start render. So in this case, you can see this, the blue bars represent a histogram that shows all the different start render times for a particular site. And you can see that pink line shows that bounce rate gets slightly worse as start render degrades. So the next question is just wanting to look at, is it loading? So as a good metric, or sorry, what are the metrics that you can investigate to understand, is the page even loading properly for the user? So very first one, also known as backend time, is time to first byte. So this is just letting you know that the server is even responding to the request. And the nice thing about time to first byte is it can be captured in synthetic and RUM, so you can actually like hold on to your data for and look at the data side by side for both. Start render is the time that it took for the initial navigation until the very first bit of non-white content is painted. So basically, does anything start to appear in the viewport? And start render, it's been around for a long time. People don't talk about it as much as I would like, because kind of newer, sexier metrics have come along. But I really love start render because it's simple, it's easy to understand, and actually, when you look at things like correlation charts of RUM data, where we look at relationships between performance metrics and conversion rate or bounce rate or any of the other kind of user or business metrics we track, start render is still a really good metric. It actually does, you can see strong correlations when you look at start render. And in case studies that I've read and case studies that I've participated in, you can also see that start render is a really good metric to track on, to actually understand if what you did to the site made it actually work better for users. So a film strip view where we're kind of illustrating start render kind of looks like this. You can sort of see at the far left of the film strip that the screen is, the viewport's empty, and then you can see that it starts to populate. And as I said, you can see in this correlation chart, this really, really strong correlation between bounce rate being much better when the page is much faster, when it has a start render of like 0.2 seconds, and how quickly bounce rate increases as start render degrades to even just 1.8 seconds. So this is really, really helpful data, especially if you need to make a business case to other people in your organization about why you need to focus on performance. So we've talked about time to first byte, and we've talked about start render as kind of good metrics to get started with is something even loading. Next question is, can I use it? Is the page even usable? So this is an interesting little bit of research from a usability study that I did a few years ago, where this wasn't even the kind of the main point of the study. We just thought, oh, it'd be interesting to see when do people start to interact with a page. And what was really interesting was that we found that about half of users, so you can see 10.5% of the people in our study waited for all images to load before they even started, like all images to load in the viewport, before they started to interact with the page. And 40.9% of them waited for most images to load. And 47% of them started to interact with the page at least as soon as text appeared. But you have like just over half of these users want most or all images to load before they start interacting. And I think that's really interesting. So if you're looking at metrics to capture to answer the question, how interactive is this page, or does it feel interactive? Thinking about when do meaningful images like visual content render is a really good thing to look at. So largest contentful paint is a metric that's part of Google's Core Web Vitals. And so I've actually included their little traffic light score that shows how they think your LCP should track in order to be considered good or needs improvement or poor by Google for SEO purposes. But what LCP is just the amount of time it takes for the largest visual image element to render. So that could be an image, it could be a video file typically. And so that's a good one. When we kind of try to validate that looking at actual user data actual performance data, you can see that there's a film strip view and this simplified sort of metrics waterfall where you can see that 0.54 seconds is when largest contentful paint fires, and the film strip view is kind of showing, okay, nothing at 0.5 seconds and a lot of content at 0.6 seconds. So yeah, it kind of falls in there. So yeah, and to me as a user, just to kind of put it through the personal test, yeah, like at 0.6 seconds, I feel like I look at that frame and I think I could interact with that. I could use that. I could start to use this website. Important thing to bear in mind is that LCP is only available in Chrome and Chromium-based browsers. So as an alternative, there's another metric called Last Painted Hero. And so hero metrics are your first H1 tag, your first your largest hero image or your largest background image. And so that's kind of a trio of metrics that we actually created at SpeedCurve, and then we open source them, so they're available to any other synthetic tools that want to track them as well. And so what you can do is track things like, well, what is the first hero element? So first image or a header that rendered, and what's the last hero element that rendered? And you can see those kind of side by side and track them over time. So that's a good alternative to LCP. So the next question we want to ask is just, how does it feel? Does the page feel janky? Like, ideally, we want pages that feel stable. We want to feel like if I start to click on something, I'm not going to accidentally click or tap on the wrong thing as the page shifts around. And so cumulative layout shift is another one of Google's core web vitals. And it's a score-based metric that kind of takes into consideration how many elements shift on the page, what is the size of the elements that shift, how much do they shift. And so it's an algorithm that's used to calculate that. And like LCP, it's available in Chrome-based browsers. But just to kind of go into a little bit more about what does it actually mean? What does it look like? Actually, I'll go back for a quick sec. So you can see these numbers, 0.1 seconds and under is considered a good CLS score. 0.25 seconds and under is kind of needs improvement, and anything above 0.25 seconds is poor. So kind of bearing that in mind, those are scores. How it's actually calculated is it's a cumulative score. So these are just a couple of screenshots showing kind of the start of a series of visuals that show the various layout shifts that happen on one page and that contribute to this cumulative score. So you can see here we've got nothing in the top left frame, and that's kind of the frame area. And then this large shift happens at about 2.3 seconds and immediately gives you this massive layout shift score of 0.613, which takes you immediately like right over Google's 0.1 threshold. And that's the start of a cumulative score. And as you kind of move down and you look at the next pair of frames, you can see that the next layout shift happens at 3.53 seconds and has a much smaller layout shift score because the elements are smaller and they're not moving around as much, but the cumulative score kind of increases. And so depending on how many shifts are on the page, this can be quite a long set of visuals where you're seeing kind of each shift that happens on the page. So some things that matter, as I said, the size of the shifting element matters. Here you can see that there's the cumulative score is quite high. The layout shift score, is not that high. It's 0.01. Even though elements shifted, you can see that slight shift up in the frame on the right. Because it didn't shift very much, even though it was a large shifting element, it didn't really ratchet up the score that much in and of itself. Important to know that image carousels can generate false positives. So sometimes some metrics, this is a good example of sometimes a metric just doesn't work for how your particular page is built. And you have to basically say, this could be a good metric for another site, for another page, but not for this particular page. And it goes to show the value, and I can't emphasize this enough, of not just relying on numbers in a time series chart or numbers in a spreadsheet when you're looking at your performance data. You really do need to visually validate using things like these layout shift visuals or film strips or whatever visuals you have on hand to make sure that what this metric is calculating is even working properly on your page, because not all metrics work on all pages. Web fonts and opacity changes can also cause issues. So you can see that from the left to the right, a web font kind of slid in and altered the content, and that basically is a contributor to the CLS score increasing. So some interesting things, and again, why you need to validate against your own site and looking at your own data. I did an analysis where I looked at a set of sites and I wanted to see, like, well, the CLS degradation have any kind of consistent measurable impact on user engagement or any kind of user or business metrics. And so I looked at bounce rate because that's an easy one. And what I found was, looking at a lot of different sites, was that in some cases bounce rate got worse as CLS degraded, in some cases it stayed the same as bounce rate as CLS degraded, and in some ways it actually even got worse, or sorry, it got better as CLS degrades. So again, you need to validate everything, and you need to understand, like, maybe this metric, I need to track it for Google's purposes if I care about SEO and Google, but does it actually, kind of come into play with my actual users and business? Maybe not. Burst input delay is kind of the third in this trifecta of core web vitals. And again, we've shown basically ideal first input delay is 100 milliseconds or less. And it's the amount of time it takes for the page to respond to user input. Again, as I mentioned earlier. And it is only measurable in RUM. Other CLS and large contentful paint, you can measure those in synthetic and RUM. FID is only measurable in RUM because it's an interaction metric. My colleague Cliff did this really great blog post. I'm not going to go into all of the detail right now, but he did note that there are a few kind of gotchas with FID where it can seem fast because the user interactions are actually taking place much later in the page's rendering cycle, after all the kind of CPU hogging things have kind of already taken place earlier in the rendering cycle. So I kind of just leave this here for you to kind of investigate and dive into at your leisure. But I feel like if I'm presenting these different metrics for you to care about, I do also want you to understand that they come with certain caveats or things that you might want to just sort of investigate and understand further, and not just to kind of accept them on just pure faith. Although, it would be lovely that you have that much faith in me, a stranger on your screen. Cliff also found that there was no correlation between FID and conversion when he looked at a lot of sessions. But when he looked at the 75th percentile of data, so basically like what is the kind of 75th percentile of people, so they're experiencing kind of not great experiences on your site, not the worst, but definitely not average or median either. And he did see that there was a stronger correlation between FID and conversion rate. Okay, so long tasks is a metric that we really recommend people look at if you need to measure across all browser types, which I expect that you do, but also if you want to measure in synthetic and RUM. And so what a long task is the definition of that is any JavaScript function that takes 50 milliseconds or longer. And a long task isn't the same as a blocking script, although sometimes those two things can be conflated, or a blocking script can also be a long task. But a long task can be a non-blocking script that just takes a while to parse. And if you have long tasks, or a lot of long tasks on the page, so a lot of individual scripts that have that would be considered long tasks, it can really make the page feel very, very janky. And so it's kind of more of a user experience metric than just a rendering metric. You can track longest tasks, you can track the number of long tasks on a page, you should track the total long task time. These are all different things that you can kind of be looking at whenever you're thinking about long tasks, but definitely recommend that long tasks are something that you learn more about and consider adding to your performance budget repertoire. The other great thing is that, again, as part of the investigation that Cliff did into FID, when he looked at long tasks as an alternative to FID, there was a really high correlation between long tasks, excessive long task time, and conversion, as you can see from this chart. So some other metrics to consider. Custom metrics. So what we mean when we talk about custom metrics, so I'm using the royal we, in our industry, when we talk about custom metrics, is these are timestamps that you actually add to the code on your page that mark the timestamps around specific pieces of content. So, and you can do this once you've added these timestamps to the page, and I've included the link to the W3C spec and a little bit more content to learn more about custom metrics and how they work. But basically, once you've added these timers to your pages, you can capture data in synthetic and RUM tools that support custom metrics, which I think by now is pretty much all of them. So for example, you want to know how long it takes for a main product image to display on your site. So you want to make sure that you're measuring a very specific image. You could put a custom timer around that. Some good examples: Twitter has a custom timer called time to first tweet. Pinterest has a custom timer called pinner wait time. And cars.com has a custom time to interactive metric that it's a little bit kind of in their own black box, but there's a lot of different things you can do. I recommend being really focused about it, because if you start tracking a lot of different custom timers, it can get really, really kind of messy in your charts, and it's just a lot to take on. Unfortunately, custom timers, a little tricky to implement. You got to manage them. Content in your page changes. It means you've got to change the custom timers as well. And so for that reason, only roughly 15%, sometimes less, depending on kind of when I look at HTTP archive data, use custom timers. So that's kind of something to bear in mind. You kind of do need to have a team that can maintain them. But again, great if you have the resources and the in-house expertise to manage custom timers. Lighthouse scores are, by now most people are familiar with Lighthouse, but if you're not, this is another Google initiative where it calculates scores based on audits run on your synthetic tests, and it checks your page against rules, very specific rules for a few different categories. So there's performance rules, SEO rules, PWA rules, and then for each of these categories you get a score out of 100, and then you get very detailed recommendations on what to fix. And I really recommend that you check out Lighthouse if you're not doing that already. So kind of looks like this. You get these different scores, and then you can expand and see, well, what are the actual audits and what are the different rules and the diagnostics. So you can actually get a really great punch list of what to fix on your page. Again, caveat, this is a great blog post that explains how you can build a really, really, really inaccessible site and still get a perfect Lighthouse score on it. So again, I'm just putting this out there. I think I have very good feelings about Lighthouse and about Lighthouse scores, and I think they definitely fill a need. But you do want to make sure that you're actually looking at your pages to make sure that you're not kind of falling into this camp of like, oh, our Lighthouse scores are great, and we don't need to fix anything, and you might actually still need to fix some things. Some other things to look at: page size and total requests. You want to still avoid serving really huge pages to mobile. It's part of it is, the bigger the page, the more things can go wrong. But as I mentioned earlier, the more resources on a page, the more likelihood there is of some of those resources going a bit rogue, having lots of long tasks, that sort of thing. And then there's just also the CPU hogging, that parsing all those resource houses on your device's CPU. And then just, blowing people's data plans. I say this as somebody who has been quite shocked at how much data I've managed to eat through when I've traveled out of country, for example. So this is an example of just a kind of a typical page for a media site. And I'm not going to name which one, but, easily over 3 megs in size, and this with 230 requests. And this is a page that was being served to mobile devices. So something just really strongly to be aware of. I really like these performance budgets from Zillow, where they track image requests and image size, and they, got notified right away if having somebody had introduced a large image, an unoptimized image, or kind of suddenly too many images to a page. So in this case, they noticed that their image request budget suddenly shot up, but also they noticed their image size budget really shot up. And so it helped them to kind of triangulate really quickly on like where there might have been an issue. Tracking third parties, I cannot recommend this enough. There's a few different things you can track on, like long tasks, as I mentioned earlier. You can actually track individual long tasks times for each individual third party. And I highly recommend you do that because you might be surprised at what you learn. You can also track the total size of each third party in terms of like total kilobytes and the total number of requests that each third party makes. So for example, looking at Google Analytics as a script, so easy to just pick Google to kind of pick on. They're just the big elephant in the room. I can't take them down. So Google Analytics, this script is, interestingly, these charts are very typical for what I see when I look at third-party metrics for a lot of different customers. And so the total number of requests, only 2. It's about this, it's pretty flat, doesn't change very much. Total size of the requests, 18 kilobytes, doesn't seem like very much. But where you see all that variability is in this green line where you see like the long task time for this particular script. And you can see sometimes it's great, but sometimes it's shooting up above 50 milliseconds and as high as 100 milliseconds. And so that's something that you might want to have more visibility into. Just the number of requests and the size of the request isn't enough for third parties. So some metrics you might not want to track. And I'm aware that this is where it gets kind of controversial. That's why I use this alarming red screen. Because you might still be tracking some of these and you might still actually, in fairness, have good reasons to track them. But if you're tracking them just because you've been told to, or you've been doing them for a long time and haven't validated them recently, you might want to consider just checking it again with them, doing that validation, and maybe considering kind of more up-to-date metrics that are going to help you fine-tune kind of what it is you actually want to look at on your site. So speed index was a great metric. It was algorithm based. It gave you a score that, in a nutshell, told you the average time at which the visible parts of the page are in the viewport and are pretty stable. The problem with speed index was that it just had lots of different gotchas that made it not reliable for many pages. And so it kind of served its purpose at the time that it came out several years ago to make people realize, like myself included, that we needed to do more than just look at crude things like page load time or start render, but actually to think about, well, how does the content actually render? Like what's happening between kind of when the page starts to render and when it fully renders, and to kind of look at that in between space. And so it was really a great metric for doing that, but we have better metrics now. Load time, again, just kind of measure, and load time and fully loaded time, they're not the same. Load time is just from the start of the initial navigation to the beginning of the Windows load event, the onload event, and fully loaded is when everything loads on the page. These are more meaningful metrics 10 years ago when pages were simpler. Now pages are just so complex that you can have, your meaningful content pretty much on the screen at 2.8 seconds, but the page isn't fully loaded till 35.37 seconds. And so if you're focusing on fully loaded, you might still want to track it just to understand like when content has gone rogue or some JavaScript is just never, it's just the page is just never resolving. A really long fully loaded time can give you that information. But as a user experience metric, not so much. So now all these first paint metrics, these were kind of really hot a few years ago. So we have first paint, first contentful paint, first meaningful paint. They all sound really great because it sounds like, okay, paints, that means something is showing up in the browser, something in the viewport. And first is like, okay, the first thing that shows up. That seems like something I would want to track. So first paint, pixels first start to render. First contentful paint, text and graphics start to render. But the problem with FCP is that it often captures non-meaningful paints like headers and nav bars and things like that. So content you don't actually care about that much. And first meaningful paint is basically trying to be a little bit more nuanced than the previous paint metrics and say like, well, what is actually a meaningful piece of content, like a big thing that happens in the layout of the page and so it's trying to be a little bit more nuanced and more specific, like trying to tell you when visual content is rendered. Well, an analysis that my colleague Joseph Wynn did a couple of years ago when he looked at 40 top-ranked Alexa sites was that 95% first paint events were happening before start render. 50% of first meaningful paint events were happening before start render. And what that means is basically a lot of these paint events were firing when the viewport was still blank for all intents and purposes. Timed interactive is, I'm going to just read this because this is a funny one. It sounds like a great metric because like, great, when can I interact with the page? When is the page going to actually function? Here's the definition. It's the first span of 5 seconds where the browser main thread remains unblocked for more than 50 milliseconds after first contentful paint is fired with no more than 2 in-flight requests. Or TLDR, a page can be interactive well before TTI fires. So it's the problem with time to interactive was we found when we actually look at it in film strips is that it just often comes in way too late. So again, looking at the same film strip we looked at earlier, 2.8 seconds, you've got meaningful content in the browser, it looks ready to go, but timed interactive doesn't fire till 8.32 seconds. So it's just a really conservative number. So the next big question is, what should my budget thresholds even be? That's a really important question. I want to make it really clear, and the performance budgets are not the same as your performance goals. A goal is aspirational. How fast do I want my site to be eventually? And it's great to have performance goals. But budgets are pragmatic. They ask the question, how can I keep my site from getting slower while I work toward my performance goals? So you can have goals in the back of your mind, but while you set your budgets to actually kind of keep yourself honest and keep from getting worse. And the idea is that you're kind of going to be tracking both sort of simultaneously. So priority 1, as I said before, create budgets to fight regression. So how you do that pragmatically, and kind of a hat tip to Harry Roberts for this, because when he presented this tip a year or so ago at another conference, I was like, oh my God, that's exactly how you should do performance budgets. And so I quickly adopted that as my own practice and recommendation as well. And it just makes so much sense. So what you want to do is look at your last 2 to 4 weeks worth of data, find the worst data point there and make that your threshold. And the idea is that then becomes the point you don't want to get worse than that as you're trying to get better. And so you can see here for this particular site, things did get better. And so ideally things continue to get better. And in 2 to 4 weeks, when you revisit this data, you're going to reduce the threshold to maybe even 2 seconds. And that becomes your new threshold. So priority 2 is you want to set long-term goals. So goals for your site. So there are a few questions you can ask yourself when you're setting goals, which is, how fast are my competitors? You know, there's a kind of a rule of thumb that you want to be 20% faster than your fastest competitor. So here, if Amazon is a competitor and they have a start render time of like around 1 second, you would like to be under 1 second. And you can use whatever benchmarking tool you use to kind of track that. You can also look at case studies, as I mentioned before, and kind of see like, okay, well, what do other people in my industry or just people in e-commerce as a whole, what did they do, and where do they tend to see good results, and kind of take that kind of under advisement. Or if you're looking at RUM data and you're creating correlation charts, you can see, oh, okay, well, I see that in this correlation chart, when I have start render that's under 0.5 seconds, my bounce rate is as low as 40.6%. I would like to get my start render to as close to that as possible across the board. How can I improve SEO? Well, again, this is where you can track your various core web vitals metrics and keep track of them over time, and bear in mind kind of, if you care about Google, again, what those vitals recommendations are, and track those and use those as your goals, those various numbers that are very publicly available. And if you are not familiar with Web Vitals and how it relates to Google search, Google is doing a gradual rollout of adding Core Web Vitals as ranking signals that will start in June. Originally it was supposed to be actually around now, but they've kind of pushed it back. And so you can kind of check the Google search blog and get more information about that there. So you can do a screenshot of this if this is helpful to you. Bear in mind, these are goals, not budgets. I don't recommend you use these as your budgets unless they miraculously happen to align with your actual numbers. But just a roundup of what you want to know, what the metric is, and how does it feel. And if you are using RUM, you might want to be tracking these at the 75th percentile because, as I said before, that's what Google cares about, and all of its recommendations are based on 75th percentiles. How do you stay on top of your budgets? Really good question. So these are some FAQs. So do I set up my performance budgets in RUM or synthetic or both? And a couple scenarios. One scenario is you can create performance budgets in RUM and then drill down into your test results in synthetic. So what that looks like, for example, is here you can see that you can track start render as a metric in RUM and synthetic. You track them in the same chart. And then when you go out of bounds, as you can kind of see flagged up there in red at 1.92 seconds, you can then drill down into the corresponding synthetic data where you're going to get all of those great lighthouse audits and performance improvement recommendations and things like that, and actually see what you need to fix. So that's a good use case right there for setting your performance budget in RUM and then doing your diagnostic piece in synthetic. Or scenario two, you can create your performance budgets in your synthetic tool and then integrate your performance budget with your CI/CD process. So a lot of synthetic tools allow you to do this now, where you can create your performance budget in your tool, and then when you go to push your page, even if you're just on your dev site, you can trigger a round of tests, and you'll get alerted that, oh, okay, actually, if we push this to production, we're going to violate our performance budgets, and you can kind of roll things back. You can break the build, you can kind of push it to production anyways, but you can kind of flag what the issues are and kind of work on them kind of as rapidly as possible behind the scenes. So you've got that option. For example, this is what an alert would look like if you violated that, and you get an alert sent to Slack or whatever webhook you would like to do. So as I said, this is kind of something that a lot of tools allow you to do now, is to integrate your synthetic testing and your performance budgets with your CI/CD process. Or should I create performance budgets for every metric I track? Don't do that unless you're only tracking a really small number of metrics. Chances are the number of metrics you're going to want to track is going to continue to grow and become more nuanced. I don't recommend creating budgets for all of them because it can look a lot like this, where you've got 50 different budgets on a page and it just looks like garbage and becomes unusable. Or you get alert fatigue because you're constantly getting alerted on things. You want to have visibility into a lot of different metrics, but really you want to pick those crucial metrics to have performance budgets for, kind of getting back to those first principles I talked about earlier. And then who should be responsible for managing your budgets? Well, one of the, I was going to just launch right into reading this. I really love this case study from Vox Media where they talk about creating performance budgets. And they made it really clear amongst themselves and as they were implementing performance budgets in their organization that they did not want to be performance cops. They didn't want to be micromanaging people's performance budgets and slapping people on the wrists and giving them warnings if they violated them. They wanted to set up best practices, educate people within the org about what those best practices are, help people to set their own performance budgets on the metrics they care about, whether it's SEO related or third party related, depending on what team you're part of, and then have those people have the tools to manage their own budgets, get alerted when things break, and take care of fixes. So I just put this here because I really like this chart, which is showing like a great web performance win where you can see things kind of dropping down and this 50% improvement in, time to interactive. But it's just really great to kind of be able to have those wins kind of shareable and broadcast them within your org and outside your org as well, for that matter. So just remember, I've gone a little bit over here, so I'm just going to wrap things up. If you're just getting started with performance budgets, or maybe your budget's gotten out of hand and you want to kind of just go back to first principles and revisit things, start as small as you can. Look at your own pages and data. Don't derive your budgets from what you've even done at previous sites and previous companies. Really stick with the site that you're working with. Tailor metrics to your audiences. So maybe you have an audience, like maybe your SEO team, maybe all they care about is your SEO score in Lighthouse and your core web vitals. That's it. Just give them those metrics and don't fuss about the other ones for them. Maybe your executive team only cares about how many unhappy users they have versus how many happy users they have. And so you're just going to track that and share that with them and show them that your users are staying happier, getting happier. One metric is fine if that's the right metric for that audience. Remember that metrics are always evolving. This talk is very different from talks that I've given in previous years about what metrics to focus on. It's probably going to age poorly in the sense that in 2 years, I'm going to be like, oh, I have to redo this talk. But that's okay. Metrics are getting better, and I would be really disappointed if they weren't. So metrics are going to keep changing, and it's kind of up to us to kind of keep track of them and update our tools and what we focus on as we evolve. And never stop measuring. Just always be measuring and staying on top of what's going on so you can fight regressions and just get faster, but don't get worse. So thank you very much for your time. I'm going to be in the Slack for a little while longer, but if you're watching this at a later date, you can find me on Twitter at Tam Everts. And thank you very much.